Good. Okay. Is it any better or not?
Yeah.
Still?
No, this is perfect.
All right. Thank you. Sorry for interruption. Okay. So am I good to go?
Yeah, please do.
All right. Okay. Hi. Good. Not morning for you, afternoon and evening for you, Ali. So thank you for having me. So,
Thank you.
and like Ali mentioned, this is basically like I am less than 2 weeks in the new job. So we have actually PowerPoint template, but I think this is a little bit rushed. So I think the format may not be necessarily the best, but hopefully the content you will find it useful. So this is a collation of some of the slides that you might have seen. Some of you, like Julia, you might have seen previously, some other new ones that I'm actually bringing in. I am not actually talking about transfer function block diagram. I assume that I'm probably one of the speakers at the very tail end of the series of presentations. So I'm not going into much mathematics. I'm assuming that people that are watching this have some good understanding of grid forming technology. But if something I'm mentioning is fast paced or you don't have background, we can definitely take them as questions. So, and these are basically a series of anonymized practical experiences looking at different types of power systems and different grid forming technologies. Most of my discussion here is on grid forming batteries. At the very end, I will have some discussion about grid forming statcom, and that's all. So starting from the first topic that I'm introducing for today is grid forming batteries under what I call medium system strength conditions. And you might ask what the medium system strength is, and I cannot give basically a particular number, but basically, let's say, I don't know, SCR of 3. So the kind of thing that or what is it really the main point here, that you can segregate to a very large extent the interrelationship between voltage control and frequency control, rather than what SCR we're talking about. If there is a strong or any interrelationship between voltage and frequency control. So in this case, we're saying that there is not basically, and then I will show you another example where there is a strong interaction. This is something that I started to present like 2 years ago, and it has been evolving a bit. And this is basically not just for grid forming inverters, for any inverter connected device, whether grid forming or grid following. And then there are some differences basically. So what I've done here is that basically we're saying that we have some certain total current, which is determined by the limits of the semiconducting switching devices. And the total current, because of a combination of the grid code requirements and also the protective function that the device need to be fulfilled, there is only finite level of current that is available during a steady state and during fault conditions that should be assigned to different functions, first and foremost for active and reactive current. And essentially the color coding here is such that things that I've highlighted in green, basically they can be provided at low cost and maybe should be provided because of grid code requirement and does not have any side effects. So speaking of side effect, I will talk about some of them as we go through. And then we have the basically boxes that have been highlighted in orange, basically things like inertia or damping or harmonic cancellation or additional fault current, that if they can be provided, it's fine. But basically, it's a prioritization of a limited current available in an era that many OEMs will confirm the overload capability as 1 unit. Speaking of OEM, I have a slide that compare them together, and that's presented last year. But this is the key point that I would like to mention. Really, the main point, there are so many boxes, you may not basically be paying attention about all, that's fine. Really, the key point is that this is a current limited device. So it's on the face value is not different to a grid following inverter, you have a limited current, you can do a lot of things. It's fine. So I'm sure you have heard what those a lot of things are, but there is a prioritization as to which of those functions and associated current will need to take precedence. Okay, so that was basically a general view, regardless of anything really for grid forming inverters. Now, the title of this particular aspect was the medium system strength condition, and how I differentiated was that there is very little or no coupling, most often no coupling between the voltage and frequency control. And in this case, I'm saying things like additional fault current. What is the benefit of that, especially if it comes at significant cost, and likewise the sustained overload capability. So I would actually challenge that none of this is needed under such condition. It's really what you saw from previous slide, and then I've done a further delineation, like here in the previous slide I talk about damping, and then I come here and divide it into electrical damping and electromechanical damping. So they might seem the same, but they are very different, because depending, I'm sure you have seen the hierarchical structure of control of a grid forming inverter, depending on which one you want. So if it's like electrical damping, you need to be really tackling that from the fastest possible control. So, and which means that you need to have a current control. Basically with voltage control you can't do that. If it's and not every device has that, I will get to that point in a second. If you have that, is fantastic. So these are the types of functions that are most desired. And likewise, we're coming back here, transient reactive current. So this is required by grid code, depending on how much of positive or negative sequence current required in different countries, basically. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier. So this is basically a work that I did last year, basically, and these are all real manufacturers based on real information, and they all actually batteries. Like I said, all my discussion is on battery, except the very last slide that I will also talk about the grid forming statcoms. And looking at these OEMs from many different perspectives, because there may be a perception that every single inverter is the same, and they can be the same, but at this point in time, obviously this technology is evolving, and not all manufacturers deliver the same capability. Some of the key differentiators, like obviously we're talking about some of the basic things, if the phasor domain or EMT model are available. Technology type, I'm not really too conscious about that. So there are different technologies, and really it's not one technology is better than the other. And surely there may be a misunderstanding that because we have like virtual synchronous machine or virtual synchronous generator, this is the way of doing it or the best way of doing it. So I'm not saying there is any problem with this technology, but and we have looked at another technology that is not basically here, but technologies can be very similar. So there is not really one better or worse. One that is a basically catch-22, and I will discuss why it's a catch-22, is the inner loop current control. Some OEMs, as you see, they have it. Some others don't have it. And obviously, this will allow the inverter to maintain the current within certain level, especially if you're going with higher current. Let's say you want to provide 1.5 per unit or 2 per unit. That's where the IGBTs are going to be more exposed. Therefore, you need a really precise, fast control of the current, which is when this comes into the picture. It might seem everything is fantastic, so why is catch-22? So I'm not talking about that here, because I have a couple of slides later. I will come back to this point. And basically this, what I'm calling GFM to GFL switch over during FRT, which is a direct consequence of having inner loop current control, because as the fault happened because of active and reactive current, especially reactive current to meet the statutory requirement, there is a very high chance, if not guaranteed, that you're going to hit the current limit. And once this current limit is hit, then the grid forming inverter is going to behave like a grid following inverter. And arguably, probably during the time that the grid formation is most desired. So take this into consideration. We will come back to this at a greater extent. SCR with a stand capability. This is a little bit old, and people talk about zero at islanding modes, and that is true. So, but I think what we need to be conscious is that SCR with a stand of 0 does not happen during interconnected system conditions. Not only because there is an interconnected system, so SCR cannot be 0 anyway, but here there is a significant difference. In islanded conditions, basically the requirement for different aspects, whether fault right-through or active reactive current injection, are very different. When you're coming to grid connected mode, those requirements are tighter. And secondly, there are other devices in the network that interact with the device that you are considering. If you basically were to behave in a way that you were behaving during islanding conditions, and then it's most likely going to be a very aggressive response, and it would adversely impact with other controls, whether grid forming or grid following inverters. So basically, long story short, so what has been tested is that SCR with a stand is better than grid following inverters. Definitely, that's expected, obviously, every design, but it's not 0, is not even 1, basically. It varies depending on basically design, and it varies depending on control system tuning that you can achieve like 1, which is the best under interconnected conditions, but that would likely come at the expense of not being able to meet some of the statutory or grid code requirements. Fault current, I already mentioned. It's very rare to have high fault currents, and what we have looked at also, it does not necessarily come as a significant differentiator from a system stability perspective. So I move, for interest of time, move to the other slides. So this one is similar, basically, to the previous one, except that the system strength now here is a little bit lower. How low it is? So we're talking about like, I don't know, 1.3, 1.4 SCR, and what a difference it will make. I will show you in the next slide based on a real example, real project, basically. And before I show that, so the same categorization and prioritization of current that I had shown in the previous slide. Now you see that the color have changed a little bit, and the philosophy is still the same. Let's say you have 100% rated current during transient condition, and that's not exaggerated, like I said. And as you saw in the previous slide, many OEMs confirm that as the transient over currents, or whether it's 120% doesn't really change the picture. What are the most desired capabilities based on what we have seen? At least to the Australian context, so electrical damping, which are typically subsynchronous, but they can be super synchronous. This has been basically proven the most critical one. Not necessarily, again, everyone has that, because if you want to respond to oscillations that are associated with control systems of, let's say, 5 or 10 kilohertz, then you need to be attacking that at the same frequency, which means that this must be at an inner loop, which means that there needs to be an inner loop current control. And then some other aspects like inertia or electromechanical damping or sustained overload capability, which I've highlighted here as red, meaning that it's not needed. And perhaps with something like inertia, I'll show you next slide that not only is not needed, because it's a current limited device, even if you had 3 per unit current, whether you should be providing inertia under these conditions, because it might adversely impact other aspects of response, which is exactly what we are seeing here, basically, that this is, like I said, is a low SCR, like let's say 1.3, 1.4. So this is based on a virtual synchronous machine design that as the frequency goes up or goes down, it behaves like a synchronous machine that essentially provide you a large increase in the active power. So that's basically the inertia means here. But what is happening here is that because it's a big system, the voltage and frequency are very tightly coupled. So by virtue of changing the frequency the frequency obviously changes, that's a given. But what you are doing here is that active power is also changes rapidly. So that's the inertia that you are getting. And as a result, because of the coupling, voltage also changes. As you can see, this is not a combined voltage and frequency disturbance. It's only a frequency disturbance, which results in a voltage disturbance. As you can see, voltage wasn't really, that bad. But because of this change in frequency, you see this real strike that's happening in the voltage because of the coupling. And if you were to increase the SCR to something higher, this would have gone away. The question is that if we can tune the control to basically suppress that or completely eliminate it, the answer is yes, of course. And the lower the inertia becomes, obviously, the less of this problem you will see. So what I'm trying to highlight, the main point from this slide is that provision of inertia might have been seen as a synonymous to grid forming capability, but this may not necessarily be a good thing, especially if you are under weak grid conditions. Okay, so like I said, I would some of the side effects I've already shown. So these are based on some more recent work that the potential side effects. And what I would like to highlight is that I am a big advocate of grid forming technology. So it's not really necessary to show negatives, but I feel that a lot of positives have been discussed. And it's a basically great technology, but maybe sometimes our expectation is too high that we can fix every single problem with one device, and that is not realistic with any device, and especially a current limited device. And the only way that we can basically utilize this capability to a greater extent is to understand what the limits are, because otherwise, we're not really designing what is required by the power system. So this is basically from a recent IEEE Power and Energy magazine paper. And there, it has a lot of other examples. I initially thought that I will basically present those examples, but I thought the paper is there. You can go and read it. It was published just a few weeks ago. I will take one key point from this. Basically, these two figures show the comparison of a grid forming technology against a synchronous condenser, basically. And this is a particular case, so you cannot generalize it for all cases, but this is a purposely oversized grid forming technology that, as you can see, if you look at the left-hand side, for example, fault current magnitude as function of time, it doesn't have this peak that synchronous machine give you, but this peak has no relevance to stability if your concern is system stability. So really, this is not important. Of course, there is no DC, there is no peak with a current controlled device, or grid forming or grid following technology, but it can hold the current better because it's a current limited device. Whereas here you will see a huge DC decay with a synchronous generator. So you can say that a kind of really purposely designed grid forming inverter can overperform a synchronous condenser of same or similar size. But again, like I said, this is really the kind of top-notch design that you will get, and it will come at the cost. If we need that for all application, no. One other things to consider here, and I will build on that in the next slide, excuse me, is the relationship between fault current magnitude and retained voltage. And this is not something unique to grid forming technology. It applies to grid following inverters as well. As you can see, when you get to the two extreme, one is here close to a steady state voltage, and the other is basically, so excuse me, I'm presenting the wrong way. So this is the retained voltage. If it's going to be a shallow, basically, voltage drop, or if it's going to be a voltage drop that, let's say, only 10% retained voltage or 15% retained voltage. So these are the two areas that require a little bit of attention. The one that when we're talking about less than 10% retained voltage at the inverter terminal, because of the sensitivities of semiconducting switching devices, whether grid forming or grid following inverter, they will cease injecting current. And the same doesn't apply to a synchronous machine. But it's obviously is a rarity also that this has to be really a bolted fault at a single connection point. It might impact one particular battery installation or a couple of them, but it's not going to have a system-wide impact. And then at the other side of a spectrum, if the retained voltage is very low, very high, excuse me, meaning that you have only 10% drop, basically, you may not get any appreciable current, basically. Of course, you can design the battery to inject even full current at those conditions, but with the battery technology, you should be very, very careful because it has certain number of deep charges and deep discharges. If you have only 10% voltage drop and you inject 1 per unit current, that's one of, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 cycles that the lifetime of battery can sustain. Okay, so let's continue with this discussion. So this is a point that I've been highlighting many times with regard to being current limited. Grid forming, grid following is not really different. This is a fundamental consideration. As I mentioned in previous slides, you can have grid forming technologies with a direct current limiter, or you may not have it. There are both types of designs, and at lower levels of penetration, this may not really be important. So it's nothing mandated by any grid code that you need to have direct current limiter or you don't need. So these are basically how technologies have been evolving. One thing that remains the same, the semiconducting devices, whether IGBTs or silicon carbide or anything else, are the same, and they are very sensitive to high currents, even in short time frame. Now let's consider two possibilities. If you were to have a device with direct current limitation, like I mentioned earlier, once this current limitation is hit, then it behaves like a grid following inverter. So that's one consideration. And even if you try to control the current indirectly, and what indirect means, again, I'm not showing any of these control loops with the assumption that you had seen it previously. Please feel free to ask any question if unclear. Indirect meaning that you will not have a direct current control, or you purposely try not to make it too aggressive so it does not get saturated, because what we know, once it's saturated, then you're back to grid following inverters and pretty much back to a square one. So indirect, one of the methods that people have been trying to do, there are a lot of discussion in research, and some more may be implemented in practical applications, but in practice, this is more of an infancy at this point. Things such as use of virtual impedance, basically, that is an indirect way. Instead of saturating the current, you changing the impedance such that it reduces the current at the rated current or below the rated current. And the catch here is that this could also degrade the overall or other aspects of stability of grid forming technology. And to be most effective, you will need still to have that at the fastest control loop. So which means that you really need to have a current control because if you were to put it at the left-hand side, it's going to be slower and much less effective. Now, a point that based on this work that I am summarizing here, and is a little bit of generalization, but based on what we have seen currently, I believe is consistently the case that a well-performing grid-forming inverter, the second last bullet point, I'm reading it, is the one that always operated below the rated current. And why is that? Because if you operated below the rated current, you know that none of those unexpected dynamics will come into the play. Current is not limited, is not saturated, so you always have a grid-forming inverter, which means that you might need to sacrifice provision of current. So do you prefer to have a device that have very low or no susceptibility to changes in power system, or is it just the intention to get current for sake of getting it, which may not necessarily be translating to any stabilizing functions, basically? Okay, so and the last point, because we're talking about requirement to provide a certain level of fault current, that's where most countries are, like South Australia or UK, basically, and other countries are moving, that measure system strength, which is a complex correlation of different stability phenomena with a simple proxy, which is the fault current, meaning that the higher the fault current, the better the system stability response is going to be. And that is where it's falling short here. It's nothing wrong if those additional fault current will come or is there, but I guess in this case is the problem is that if you are trying to get more current from grid forming devices, it would endanger other aspect of the response. Okay, so now moving this upside down. So everything I've discussed up to this point is looking at very low or medium system strength conditions. So we're talking about like classic SCR below 3 and things like that. One of the recent learning is that if you have many grid forming inverters to be connected and potentially in similar areas where synchronous generators are also concentrated, you may have a secondary problem that is very different to what we are familiar from grid following inverters, or even basically synchronous machines, basically. But let's leave synchronous machine out for a second. So with grid following inverters, essentially they require constant as possible a voltage. They come with very tight control of the current. So they don't have any susceptibility to current control devices, but they require basically good voltage control in the system, or a stiff voltage source, excuse me, not control per se, which the control comes from the stiffness. So with grid forming inverter, this is not the same because they are establishing their own voltage sources. However, they don't have a mechanism for current control, or if they have it, like I said, you can have it, but you most likely be ending up in the grid following mode anyway when the current is saturated. So we're not discussing that. So subtlety we have already discussed. So with grid forming inverters, essentially they most like a system that is weak in our basically common understanding, but maybe there is a classification of what is weakness, and we have basically voltage weakness and current weakness. Up to this point, we only been talking about voltage weakness, and that's works very well, but for grid following inverters and also synchronous machines, the stronger the voltage source is, the better it will be, and the current control is essentially default. That's a very notion of having grid following inverters, whereas with grid forming inverters is the other way around. And as the system become stronger, basically, you are not going to get the current control that these grid forming inverters require. So the strong system, and you can think of this as a Norton and Thevenin equivalent, basically, and zero impedance and infinity impedance. If you're thinking of it that way, essentially that a strong system is that weak in terms of current, not in terms of voltage. And that's where grid forming inverters don't like it. Of course, they can be current limited, but that's not what we want to do, because the stability of those devices will compromise, basically. So, and the points that I've put here consistent with what I have had in the previous slide. I'm just reiterating that essentially we really want a grid forming device that does not get to the 100% of the current, and also spelling out those subtleties, the two extremes. One is at very low retain voltage, and the other one at very high retain voltage. So these are the ones that we need to consider. Now, I have only one slide on the grid forming statcoms, and that is pretty much it. So with grid forming batteries, basically to date have been synonymous with grid forming technologies. We have had a lot of basically HVDC, VSC HVDCs with grid forming technology, but that's maybe for a different application. We need to define what we are looking for. I will come back to HVDC in a second. And then what else do we have? The likes of solar or wind. There is a strong interest to have offshore wind in Europe, basically with grid forming capability, but that's probably a matter of 3 to 5 years time. And why there is a strong interest? Because some of the grids and grid codes are moving towards requiring grid formation at the shore side, which basically means that if you have back-to-back HVDC, VSC HVDC, only one of those inverter or rectifier station can be grid forming with current technology. The other one must be grid following. So if you were to have a back-to-back technology, then if your shore side is grid forming, the offshore side must be grid following. And at the same time, the offshore side is where is a dead network, basically, until it is established. And that's why it would be desirable to have wind turbines with grid forming capability, but that's most demanding. So it is possible, but it's not as easy as battery storage systems, basically. Now, one other difference between HVDC and battery is that there is not really a significant capacitance or energy storage that you will have in the battery. So the first disadvantage we discussed, obviously, and I have seen some people, have been, manufacturers been working, and it's been, demonstrated in simulation space that you can have grid forming at both the shore and offshore end. But we are talking about what is proposed for installation currently or in the near immediate future. And then the second aspect, like I mentioned, is the relatively smaller, and not just in terms of magnitude, but in terms of duration as well, because you have basically capacitances, and the energy storage for capacitance is very short term. So this is the second disadvantage of HVDC, but obviously this is based on today's technology. Things are changing very rapidly. Now, the second point is important because we have exactly the same thing with the statcom. So again, it's not a huge energy storage, not anywhere comparable to a battery, but it's similar to what you have with HVDC link. So therefore, it might be argued that, okay, if this is, doesn't have as much storage, then probably it's not going to be as good a grid forming technology. And that may or may not be the case, basically. So why people considering grid forming as statcoms then? One advantage is that because of the regulatory requirements that are in place pretty much across the Western world, the utility or transmission or independent system operator cannot own a device that generate or consume megawatts. Whereas with the statcom, that problem is rectified, because obviously it has nothing to do with megawatts, and it can be owned and operated by a network owner. And as the networks are transitioning to lower or much lower levels of synchronous devices, it may be more convenient for a network owner that has intimate knowledge of their power system to determine what the gaps are and what the expected gaps are going to be in next 5 years or 10 years, and design a central device that essentially coordinates the response of many devices in the power system and provide a service to the wider power system. It's not just for a single project, but for multiple projects. So this provides obviously this particular advantage that it can be designed and operated by people that know best the network. So as an example, I've put the recent work that Fingrid has been doing to install grid forming statcoms and a synchronous condenser in a remote part of the network. So the specific objective here is to release hosting capacity of grid following inverters, wind farms in this case, that would not otherwise be able to operate stably under those conditions. In terms of storage, I have already come back to that, so I'm not basically discussing this point. Basically, the only thing to add is that obviously technologies, all technologies have been evolving and will evolve. So with the statcoms, also people coming with like flywheels or supercapacitors or many different technologies, and they all have a place. But at this point in time, no capacitance or no grid formation, no energy storage is as capable as a battery, basically. But having said that, still it has an application. One of the basically experiences with grid forming a statcom is that, and this surely will change in a year or two, but at this point in time, in terms of the proven track record and especially the model maturity. So we're talking about EMT modeling or phasor domain modeling, because the only way that a TSO or ISO can design and control these devices is to perform simulation study on their wider power system and see what the problems are and how these devices can be controlled to essentially address those problems. And especially I'm talking about like a country like Australia that have a stringent modeling requirement, and like most of you or all of you based in the US, I assume. So obviously with NERC's initiative, US is also moving in a similar trajectory. And to provide some other examples, so in Europe, this is becoming extremely popular, especially among the four German TSOs that are installing GFM statcoms, or what they can call ES-statcom, or being referred to. And this is intended to basically address the perceived decline of inertia and increase in rate of change of frequency as the synchronous generators are being retired in the power system. And that's all. I pause here.
Thank you very much, Babak. This was very interesting. Thanks for sharing your insights and experience.